I woke up to the sharp sting of burning oil slicing through the morning air, a smell that hit me like a punch to the gut. And when I stumbled to the window, I saw it. A goddamn inferno roaring in my front yard, except it wasn't some cozy bonfire. It was my tractor, Bessie, my beautiful, hardworking Bessie, now a twisted, flaming ruin. Barefoot, my robe flapping in the chilly wind, I stood on the damp grass, watching 20 years of rust, grease, and good memories twist into black smoke. And there on the sidewalk, a small knot of homeowners association members grinned smugly, whispering like they'd just rid the world of a plague. Cynthia Fairweather, their self-crowned queen, stood tall in her overpriced blazer, arms folded, her face a grotesque mask of fake pity and raw arrogance. She looked at me like I was a stray mutt who dared to pee on her pristine marble floors. "This is what happens, Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice oozing with that artificial sweetness of someone who loves breaking bad news. "When people refuse to follow community guidelines," and my fingers curled into fists. Not because I'm the violent type, I'm not, but because the rage boiling inside me had nowhere else to go. The HOA crew shifted uneasily as I stepped forward, my eyes boring into Cynthia, and I said, "You burned my tractor," my voice steady but heavy enough to crack steel, and she blinked, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, claiming it was a community decision, that I'd had ample opportunity to remove that eyesore from my yard. "We enforce aesthetic harmony in Oak Estates," she added, as if that justified torching my property, and I could smell the burning rubber and gas, see the flames licking at Bessie's frame, but my mind was already racing past their smug faces, past this petty act of vengeance. I turned, walked back inside, and slammed the door, not giving them the satisfaction of a scream or a threat. Cynthia probably thought she'd won, that I'd slink off like a scolded kid and fall in line. But she had no clue she'd just lit the fuse on a war she couldn't win. Because in my office, buried in an old storage chest, was something they'd never see coming. Dust puffed into the air as I lifted the lid, revealing a neatly folded uniform, a badge, and a thick binder of fire codes. 30 years as a fire marshal had taught me one unshakable truth. Every neighborhood HOA is a fire hazard waiting to explode, and now I was going to make their lives hell. It all started 3 weeks back with their first letter, a pretentious little note with the HOA's stupid tree logo, all formal and typed up nice. "Dear Mr. Calloway, as a resident of Oak Estates, you are required to comply with all community guidelines. We have noticed several violations, including an unauthorized, dilapidated agricultural vehicle parked in public view, and a bunch of nonsense about my landscaping and unpaid membership fees." I'd laughed out loud, because I'd lived here before their HOA even existed, my land, my house, my rights. That letter, with its veiled threat of escalating enforcement measures, sounded like a toddler with a thesaurus throwing a fit. So I ignored it, but then more came, slipped under my door, stuck to my truck's windshield, one even taped to my dog. Then they showed up in person, Cynthia and her enforcer, Greg Whitmore, a suburban nightmare who took his compliance officer, gig way too seriously, standing on my porch like they were about to exorcise a demon. "Mr. Calloway," Cynthia had said, her tone dripping with fake patience, "I assume you've received our notices," and I leaned on the railing, sipping my beer. Didn't read 'em," watching her nostrils flare as Greg chimed in about my lawn's blade height and Bessie being an unregistered agricultural vehicle. I'd laughed then, but now, staring at the ashes of my tractor, the laughter was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. The flames had died down by the time I finished my beer that morning, but the rage inside me burned hotter than ever. A steady, simmering heat that wouldn't let go as I watched the last wisps of smoke curl up from Bessie's charred corpse. I wasn't about to let this slide, not after Cynthia and her HOA goons turned my tractor into a sacrificial pyre. I spent the afternoon gathering evidence, methodical as ever, snapping photos of the wreckage, checking my security cameras for anything I could use, documenting every detail because this wasn't just some neighborhood spat anymore. It was arson, property damage, harassment, maybe even conspiracy, and I knew the law better than they ever would. I placed a call to an old friend at the fire department, Hank, a gruff guy who'd seen me through decades of inspections, and said, I need a formal fire safety check of Oak Estates, every violation, every infraction. And when he asked what was going on, I just stared at Bessie's remains and muttered, "Some folks here haven't been playing by the rules." I'd spent my career putting out fires, literal and figurative, but now I was ready to start one, and the HOA had no idea the kind of heat I was bringing. It all traced back to that first Saturday when Cynthia and Greg showed up on my porch, acting like they owned the place, Greg pointing at my yard like a detective at a crime scene, rattling off violations. Lawn too long by 2 inches, mailbox not up to their precious standards, and Bessie, my unregistered agricultural vehicle, like she was some blight on their perfect suburbia. I'd sipped my beer smirking and said, "It's a tractor, Greg," but he huffed about aesthetic standards, while I pointed out the 12-foot metal chicken some guy built down the street. Apparently that was art, but my tractor was an abomination, and Cynthia pursed her lips, warning me they'd take action if I didn't join their little club and comply. I'd waved them off, laughing, thinking their threats were empty. But now, with Bessie gone, I saw how far they'd go, and it was time to flip the script. 30 years as a fire marshal gave me more than just a badge. It gave me a playbook they couldn't even read. The next morning, I sat on my porch with coffee, watching the HOA patrol strut through the neighborhood like a pack of wannabe soldiers. Greg in his pressed polo and khakis leading the charge, clipboard in hand, pausing every few houses to scribble down their petty infractions. Overgrown shrubs, unapproved paint colors, whatever nonsense they could pin on folks to keep their power trip alive. They reminded me of the firefighters we used to haze, the ones who loved paperwork but froze when the real heat hit. And when Greg stopped in front of my house, shaking his head and pretending to write something, I just waved, sipping my coffee. He looked pissed that I wasn't rattled, but that was fine. Soon he'd have bigger problems than my attitude. I spent the morning digging through my old notes, pulling every fire code I could remember, and it didn't take long to see Oak Estates was a disaster waiting to happen. Unapproved propane tanks stacked too close to homes, wooden fences too high, hydrants buried under decorative bushes, fire lanes so narrow a truck couldn't squeeze through. It was a tinderbox dressed up as perfection. The irony was almost too rich. They'd torched Bessie for community safety while sitting on a powder keg of their own making, and I called Captain Riley, my old buddy from the department, asking if he'd fancy a tour of a neighborhood that'd forgotten what fire codes even were. He laughed, said he'd send a team within the week, and that was all I needed to set the wheels spinning. Cynthia and her minions thought they were untouchable, policing mailbox colors and lawn heights, but they were about to meet real authority, and I'd be damned if I didn't enjoy watching them squirm. By midweek, I could feel the tension brewing in Oak Estates, a quiet hum beneath the usual drone of lawnmowers and barking dogs, because while Cynthia and her HOA cronies thought they'd scored a victory with Bessie's ashes still warm, I was already 3 steps ahead, plotting their downfall with the precision of a man who'd spent decades sniffing out hazards. I spent the day combing through my binder of fire codes, cross-referencing every violation I'd spotted. Propane tanks too close to foundations, overgrown hedges blocking hydrants, fences that turn a small spark into a neighborhood barbecue. And the list grew longer with every page, a ticking time bomb I couldn't wait to drop in their laps. That evening, another envelope slid under my door, a final warning stamped in bold red letters, threatening not just fines but legal action, even eviction from my own damn house for refusing to bow to their standards. I laughed, because evicting me from a home I'd owned before their HOA existed was the kind of delusion only Cynthia could cook up. She wanted to play legal games, but I'd been in the game longer, and I knew the rules she couldn't even spell. This wasn't her sandbox anymore. That night, I sat back with a whiskey, watching the security footage of Bessie's fiery end, frame by frame, until I caught it. A flicker of movement, a shadow too close to the tractor right before the flames erupted, and when I sharpened the image, there he was. Greg Whitmore, his smug face glowing in the firelight, a lighter flickering in his hand. I smiled, slow and cold, because this wasn't just evidence. It was a guillotine, and I'd just found the rope. Greg had handed me everything I needed to bury them, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. The next day, chaos hit Oak Estates like a freight train. Captain Riley and his fire inspection team rolled in unannounced. Trucks lining the street, uniformed officers scribbling notes, measuring hydrant distances, slapping bright red hazard stickers on anything that didn't pass muster, and the neighborhood's perfect little facade cracked wide open. Homeowners peeked from behind curtains, confused and jittery, watching their pristine paradise get dissected, while Cynthia stormed out, blustering for answers. Riley just flashed his badge, cool as ice, and told her a formal investigation was underway, no debate, no appeal, just facts. Greg tried to slink off, his khakis practically trembling, but I caught him by his car, leaning against the driver's side door with a grin, and said, "Arson's a serious crime, you know," watching his face twitch as I pulled out my phone and played the footage. His grainy night vision self, the lighter, the fire starting right where he stood. He stammered, claiming it was a misunderstanding, an accident, that he was just clearing my property. But I let him babble, digging his hole deeper, then gave him a choice. Confess to me now or let the fire department sort it out with cuffs. He chose the former, blubbering about following orders, and I knew I had them both by the throat. An hour later, Cynthia called an emergency HOA meeting, barring me from the room. But I showed up anyway, strolling in as they argued over the mounting violations. Some board members panicked, seeing their cushy reins slipping, while Cynthia, red-faced, tried to downplay it all, insisting they could fight this, but I cleared my throat and the room went dead silent. The air in that HOA meeting room was thick with desperation. A dozen wide-eyed board members staring at me like I'd just kicked over their sandcastle. And I stood there, hands in my pockets, letting the silence stretch until it hurt. Cynthia, red-faced and fuming, tried to hold her ground, barking that this was a private meeting, but I just grinned and said, "Yeah, and that's a private hydrant out there with a tree choking it." "Looks like you've got a mess on your hands," I added, casual as could be. "Violations, fines, potential criminal charges, not to mention your little arson problem running around." And I watched the color drain from their faces as the reality sank in. Some of the newer members shifted, one nervously asking, "What do you want?" while Cynthia scoffed, still clinging to her throne. I leaned forward, voice low and steady. "I want you to resign, all of you, dismantle this HOA before it collapses on its own." And when she snapped, "That'll never happen," I nodded, pulling out my phone, Greg's confession video queued up, and said, "Then I'll let this fire inspection report go public, let the city start handing out citations, let the state fire marshal dig into your safety records, and oh, I'll leave this gem with the authorities." Cynthia's jaw tightened, the others squirmed, their carefully built empire crumbling right there in that stuffy room. And I saw it in their eyes, the dawning truth that they'd never really had control, that I'd just turned their game board upside down with 30 years of fire marshal know-how and a knack for spotting weak spots. "You'll regret this," she hissed, barely a whisper as I shrugged and walked out. "You burned my tractor," leaving her seething and the vote hanging in the air. I didn't need to stay. I knew how it'd go, because the next morning, Oak Estates felt different, the usual smug hum of HOA dominance replaced by a jittery uncertainty. The fire department's inspection had ripped through like wildfire. Every homeowner slapped with a citation, a warning, or an order to fix something. Those same folks who'd bragged about the HOA keeping things in order were now sobbing on their lawns over fines they couldn't pay, and I sipped my coffee, watching their perfect little world unravel thread by thread. By noon, the real damage showed. Word of Greg's arson stunt leaked, turning the neighborhood into a buzzing hive of anger and speculation. No one wanted to be tied to a board that greenlit torching property, and the cracks in their reign split wide open faster than I'd expected. A news crew rolled up, some slick-haired reporter with a fake smile standing outside the HOA office, microphone in hand, delivering the blow. "Residents of Oak Estates are in shock after a former fire marshal exposed major safety violations and alleged acts of arson within the homeowners association." And the camera caught neighbors muttering, some furious, one woman snarling, "We paid these people to keep things safe, and now we're stuck with fines and illegal fire traps. What the hell were they doing?" Cynthia holed up inside, refusing to talk, but I wasn't done. I spent the afternoon triple-checking my footage, the timestamp clear as day, Greg's smug face lighting up the screen, and sent it all to the fire department, the police, and the city council, exhaling slow as I hit send. It was over for them now. That night, I woke to flashing lights slicing through my blinds and the wail of sirens bouncing off the houses, a sound I knew too well from my fire marshal days. And when I stumbled to the window, I saw it. The HOA office engulfed in flames, a roaring beast eating through their precious rules and fines like they were kindling. A crowd had gathered, neighbors in robes and slippers, some whispering about divine justice, others openly guessing who'd done it. But I already had my suspect. Greg, the loyal little arsonist who'd torched Bessie, probably figured he'd burn the evidence or send a message, maybe just cracked under the pressure of his own mess. Fire trucks lined the street, hoses blasting, and by the time the flames were out, the police were waiting. Greg tried to bolt, his khakis no match for the sprint, and they tackled him to the pavement before he made it half a block, cuffs snapping on as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Cynthia wasn't far behind. The next morning, cops showed up at her door with a warrant. Conspiracy, fraud, negligence, a laundry list that'd been piling up. And as they let her out in cuffs, the neighborhood stood frozen, no cheers, no shouts, just the quiet weight of her fall, her eyes locking on mine through the squad car window, screaming silent fury while I just sipped my coffee. She thought this wasn't over, but it was. The city disbanded the HOA within days, citing gross misconduct and legal failures, and the board members who hadn't been arrested slunk off in disgrace, their reputations shredded beyond salvage, leaving Oaked Estates lighter, like a storm had passed and cleared the air. People who'd never spoken started chatting over fences, swapping HOA horror stories, laughing at old grudges, some even painting their houses wild colors. Bright purples, neon greens, like a middle finger to the rules that choked them for years. And I watched it all unfold, content with the chaos I'd sparked. One afternoon, as I tinkered with Bessie 2, my new tractor gleaming with more horsepower than I'd ever need, Captain Riley swung by, leaning on my fence with a smirk. In all my years, I've never seen a fire marshal take down an HOA single-handed. And I grinned, wiping grease off my hands. Guess there's a first time for everything. He chuckled, then got serious. Final reports came back. The HOA had been fudging safety inspections for years. Cities not just shutting them down, they're talking full redevelopment of the neighborhood. And I raised an eyebrow. So I made the place safer. He nodded. Something like that. Then paused, eyeing me like he was sizing up an old tool he'd forgotten he had. Ever think about getting back into it, Hank? We could use you maybe not full-time, just as an advisor, he said, and I glanced at Bessie too, at the quiet street, at folks finally free from Cynthia's nonsense, feeling that old itch I'd buried under years of retirement. Well, I said, smirking, seeing as I just saved a whole damn neighborhood, why not? And just like that, Oaked Estates wasn't the same prison it had been. It was something new, something free, and I'd had a hand in breaking the chains. The weeks after the HOA's collapse rolled by like a fever dream, Oaked Estates shedding its old skin with every passing day. The once stifling air of clipped lawns and nosy glares giving way to something rower, messier, alive. Neighbors who'd lived in silent resentment now waved over fences, their voices carrying tales of Cynthia's petty tyranny, some even cracking beers together like they'd just survived a war. Houses sprouted new colors, wild and unapproved, lime greens, blazing oranges, each a quiet rebellion against the rulebook that burned up with the HOA office. And I'd catch folks grinning at me as I tinkered with Bessie too, like I was some folk hero who'd slain the dragon, though I didn't say much, just nodded and kept my wrench turning. The city's redevelopment talk buzzed louder, inspectors still poking around, but now it wasn't about fines. It was about fixing what the HOA had let rot, and I'd see Riley's crew swing by, red stickers fading as real hazards got cleared, the neighborhood safer not because of Cynthia's clipboard but despite it. I'd sit on my porch with coffee, watching this strange new world unfold, knowing I'd lit the match that burned the old one down, and it felt damn good. Greg's arrest stuck. He'd confessed to both fires, Bessie, and the office, claiming he'd snapped under Cynthia's orders, though the cops didn't buy the just following directions excuse when they found lighter fluid in his garage. And he was looking at years behind bars, his khaki-clad reign over Lawn Heights officially kaput. Cynthia, meanwhile, was drowning in her own legal mess. Conspiracy charges piled on top of fraud for faking safety reports, negligence for letting the neighborhood turn into a fire trap, and her lawyer's pleas couldn't outrun the evidence I'd handed over. That security footage of Greg's flickering lighter sealing her fate as tight as a drum. She'd glare at me from the news clips, cuffed and raging, but powerless now, her kingdom reduced to a smoking ruin and a rap sheet, and I'd just sip my whiskey, letting her stew in the hell she'd built. 30 years of fire marshal instincts had taught me how to spot a blaze before it started, and I'd turned hers into an inferno she couldn't escape. Riley kept dropping by, half checking in, half nudging me toward that advisor gig, and one evening he brought a file, pages of old HOA safety logs, all doctored, dates fudged, violations ignored, a paper trail of incompetence that kept Oaked Estates teetering on disaster for years. "You exposed more than just a tractor burning, Hank," he said, shaking his head. "This place was a death trap waiting to blow." And I flipped through it, seeing the ghosts of my old career in every line, missed propane checks, blocked fire lanes, all the stuff I'd hunted down in my prime, now staring back like a call to arms. "City's serious about redevelopment," he added, "and they're asking for input, someone who knows the codes, knows the risks." And I leaned back, eyeing Bessie Two's gleaming frame, feeling that old fire flicker in my gut, not the destructive kind, but the kind that builds something better from the ashes. The neighborhood kept shifting under my feet, Oaked Estates turning into something I barely recognized, not just in the splashy paint jobs or the chatter over fences, but in the way the air felt. Lighter, looser, like a chokehold had finally let go, and I'd catch myself grinning as I worked on Bessie too, her engine purring smoother than the old girl ever did. Folks started dropping by, not with HOA notices, but with thanks. Some brought coffee, others just leaned on the fence to shoot the breeze, telling me how they'd hated Cynthia's reign but never had the guts to fight. And I'd shrug, saying it wasn't about guts, just knowing where to push when something's ready to fall. The city's redevelopment plans were picking up steam, surveyors mapping out fire lanes, contractors eyeing the old HOA office lot for something useful. A park, maybe, or a community shed. And Riley's visits turned into strategy sessions, him tossing me ideas about safety upgrades, me sketching out fixes on napkins, the old fire marshal muscle memory kicking in like I'd never left. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure this place didn't slide back into the mess I'd torched, and I liked that, like the weight of it. Greg's trial was quick. Arson's hard to argue when you're caught on tape, and his stammering about orders didn't sway the judge, who slapped him with 5 years. A sentence that rippled through the neighborhood like a warning shot. No one talked about him much after, just another ghost of the HOA's collapse. Cynthia's case dragged longer, her lawyer scrambling to dodge the conspiracy and fraud charges, but the evidence was a brick wall. My footage, the faked safety logs, the fire department's reports. And when she got 3 years plus restitution, the news hit like a quiet thunderclap, folks nodding over their morning papers, satisfied but not surprised. I'd see her face on TV, all venom and no power, and I'd think back to that first letter, that prissy little note about Bessie being an eyesore, and how she'd never guessed the stray dog she kicked would bite back hard enough to bring her whole castle down. 30 years of sniffing out fire hazards had made me a damn good hunter, and she'd been the biggest blaze of all. Riley showed up one crisp afternoon, a grin tugging at his weathered face, carrying a thick envelope stamped with the city's seal, and he tossed it on my workbench, saying, "They're offering you the advisor gig, official like, part-time, flexible, just enough to keep this place from burning itself down again." I flipped it open, scanning the terms, decent pay, a say in the redevelopment, a chance to shape Oaked Estates into something that didn't need a dictator with a clipboard. And I thought about Bessie's ashes, about the smug grins I'd wiped off those HOA faces, about how good it felt to turn chaos into something solid. "You in?" he asked, and I glanced at Bessie too, at the street where kids now played without some jackass measuring their grass, and nodded. "Yeah, I'm in. Someone's gotta keep the fires under control, right?" Oaked Estates settled into its new rhythm as spring crept in, the redevelopment kicking off with a quiet hum. Bulldozers cleared the old HOA office rubble, making way for a scrappy little park with benches and a fire pit, a nod to the chaos that birthed it, and I'd watch from my porch, Bessie 2 gleaming in the driveway, neighbors strolling by without that old edge of fear. The city took my advisor gig seriously, dragging me into meetings where I'd point out hydrant placements or flag propane risks, my voice carrying weight again. And I'd catch Riley smirking across the table, like he'd known all along I'd slide back into this life. Folks started calling me Hank the Torch, half as a joke, half out of respect, and I didn't mind because I'd burned down the right things to build something better. Kids raced through the streets now, lawns grew wild if people felt like it, and the chatter over fences turned into barbecues, the kind Cynthia would have fined into oblivion. Every laugh, every unpainted mailbox felt like a middle finger to her reign, and I'd sip my coffee, soaking it in, knowing I'd handed them that freedom. It wasn't perfect. Some grumbled about the changes, others missed the old order. But it was alive, messy, and theirs, and that was enough. Greg faded into a footnote, serving his time somewhere far off, his khakis swapped for prison grays, while Cynthia's name only popped up when someone dug through the legal wreckage. Her sentence held, her appeals fizzled, and the restitution drained whatever she'd squirreled away, leaving her a bitter shadow no one here cared to remember. The news crews moved on, chasing fresher scandals, but the story stuck in Oaked Estates like a legend. How a retired fire marshal took down an HOA with a tractor's ashes and a binder of codes, and I'd hear it retold at those barbecues, folks embellishing my standoff with Greg or Cynthia's porch threats, turning me into some suburban vigilante. I'd just grin, tinkering with Bessie 2, letting them spin it however they wanted. Truth was, I'd seen a fire hazard, same as always, and put it out. Only this time it wasn't flames, but a system that choked this place for years. And 30 years of instinct had made it second nature. Riley swung by one evening, leaning on my fence as the sun dipped low, tossing me a beer and saying, "City's happy with the progress. Hydrants are clear, fire lanes are wide, and no one's torching tractors lately." And I cracked it open, nodding, "Good, let's keep it that way." He eyed me that old captain's glint in his stare and added, "You did more than save a neighborhood, Hank. You gave it a spine." And I shrugged, glancing at Bessie 2 at the park where kids laughed, at the houses painted every damn color under the sun, feeling that quiet fire still flickering in me. Not rage now, but purpose, the kind that carried me through decades of inspections and into this fight. "Guess I just saw something that needed fixing," I said, and he chuckled. "Yeah, and you fixed it good," leaving me there as dusk settled, the weight of what I'd done sinking in. Oaked Estates was free, safer, mine again in a way it hadn't been, and I'd made damn sure no one forget the guy who turned a burning tractor into a revolution.